Today, I want to have a conversation about what is trauma. I think sometimes we assume that everybody knows what trauma is, but today I just want to make sure that you are clear about what trauma is. By definition, trauma is an emotional, psychological, and sometimes physical response to an event that overwhelms you and actually causes you to be at a disadvantage on how to cope with it. So, as you can see from that definition, trauma is a physical response or a psychological response to an event. It is not the event itself. For example, that's how come two people can get into a car accident and one person can walk away saying, "Thank you, God, that you spared my life." And the other person can walk away thinking, "Oh my gosh, how am I going to get this car fixed? Oh my gosh, the rest of my day is ruined. Oh my gosh, how am I going to do this?" So we had the same event happen to two different people, but their response to the event was significantly different. So I first want you to recognize that trauma is not the actual event itself. It's actually how you respond to the event. That response is typically mental and emotional in regards to how that response displays itself. Now, there are various forms of trauma. There is acute trauma. There is actually also chronic trauma. There is vicarious trauma. There is complex trauma. Now, all of those different forms of trauma are very important, but I want to focus a little bit on acute trauma and also chronic trauma. Acute trauma is typically a single event that happens in your life and how you respond to that single event. For example, as I just gave you, a car accident. Another example of acute trauma could be you were raped. Another example of acute trauma could be divorce. Another example of acute trauma could be that you were in a toxic relationship. So it's a actually a single event and how you responded to that actual event. So most of the time, we don't know how to label our trauma. We're not necessarily educated enough to know if it's acute or if it's chronic, but it matters if it's acute or chronic. Chronic is more of a prolonged, repeated situation in your life and how you responded to that. So, for example, chronic would be more like you grew up in a household with an addicted parent. You grew up in an unsafe environment. You grew up and you were molested multiple times. You grew up and your parents were neglectful. You grew up and your parents were nowhere around. You were actually taken care of by a caregiver, a grandmother, or something of that nature. That could be categorized as chronic trauma. It's repeated and it's prolonged. So it actually happened more than once, or it happened for a long period of time. So I think it's very important that when we start talking about trauma, that we're very clear on what types of trauma we have experienced so that we can understand the responses that we have had to that trauma. Now, in my book, Silent Scars, Learning to Heal from Trauma, and it is actually on my actual website, www.sharonthomas.com. You can purchase a copy. We talk about responses. Responses are oftentimes connected to how you will cope. So if you do not have healthy responses when you are presented with trauma, and let's be honest, most of us do not, because once again, part of the definition of trauma is your inability to know how to cope with the trauma. So oftentimes we find ourselves in unhealthy ways of coping because we don't know a healthy way, because who really has taught us how to be emotionally intelligent enough to deal with something that happens to us psychologically and physically? Who has taught us how to respond well to those things? Most of the time, we go into a shock situation when trauma happens and we don't know how to respond. And because we don't know how to respond, we find ourselves doing things that are not healthy. Now, what I'm going to continue to do is to speak in reference to acute trauma and chronic trauma. Now that we have given some verbiage to various types of trauma, I want to elaborate more on those actual different types of trauma. Now, with acute trauma, say a divorce, when you look at your response, sometimes people's response are different. Some people are like, I'm so glad I was able to get out of that marriage. Other people, it actually takes the life out of you. You feel like, how do I move forward? You feel like, how am I ever going to actually get my life back? Because I feel like I gave everything to that marriage. See, same event, but two different responses. And oftentimes that's because inside of the marriage, since we're using divorce as an example, there may have been different types of relationships there. One could have been abusive. Another one could have been, financially abusive, physically abusive, verbally abusive. It could be neglectful. There are various forms of abuse that could have been identified in that marriage that cause that acute trauma. So your responses are definitely going to be different. But oftentimes when there is acute trauma, our responses are not always healthy. And so I think it's important that when you have experienced trauma, that number one, you can define it. You can take a look at the psychological and the physical response that you have had to that trauma, and you also can identify if it's acute or chronic. So that's really basically kind of what I wanted to start off with in this particular video, is to talk to you about what trauma really is, because we use that word so loosely, but I wanted to define it for you. But I also wanted to show you different types of trauma. Now, I am going to spend more time, maybe in other videos, talking more in detail about various acute trauma and various chronic trauma and how your responses can be healthy and unhealthy to that actual event. But today, I just wanted to introduce you to the definition and also define for you two different kinds of trauma that you could have experienced in your life. I hope and I pray that this video was actually beneficial to you and that it gave you some language to some of the things you've experienced in your life. I hope you have an amazing day.